Terraria's progression is usually pretty smooth, all things considered. The early game is full of discovery as you decide which classes and areas you want to focus on. Late pre-hard mode is possibly the most balanced stage in the game by far. Early to mid-hard mode is full of cool boss fights and really interesting fun gear, and then you reach Golem, and it all goes downhill. I would say that Golem through Moonlord, also known as the late game, is the worst stage of progression in Terraria by far, and I have quite a few reasons. The first problem with this stage of the game is of course Golem himself. This stone-faced idiot doesn't pose a threat to the player at all by the time you reach him. He's about as powerful as Plantera, except he's fought with all of the insane gear that you can unlock after beating Plantera and getting new dungeon items. The only redeeming factor when it comes to Golem is his drops, but the gear he gives the player isn't even good, it's just mediocre. There isn't a lot of gear you can get after Golem, especially in comparison to what you can get after Plantera, so right after defeating Golem, the player is sent to fight the lunatic cultists straight away, and it happens way too fast. The Terraria gameplay loop is usually like this: you get gear, fight a boss with that gear, and then defeating that boss unlocks a new way to collect better gear for the next boss fight, and rinse and repeat. It's a great cycle that makes the game as fun as it is, and for some reason it simply gets ignored at the final stage of the game so that the player can immediately run after the next boss fight, and the pacing is very weird. The lunatic cultists themselves are underwhelming as a boss fight as well, very underwhelming. It's not as bad as Golem, and in expert mode or master mode it can definitely pose a challenge to the player, but it doesn't feel like the second to last boss in the entire game. On top of this, the biggest problem with the lunatic cultists is really the drops. They don't drop anything. The ancient manipulator is the only item you get after defeating the boss fight, but it's a completely unnecessary item. If you could craft late game gear with a mithril anvil or something else instead of an ancient manipulator, nothing about the game would be different. It would fundamentally be the same. Too bad boss fights isn't even the worst thing about this stage in the game though. We all know the real problem: the celestial pillars. Not much even needs to be said about this invasion. Obnoxious effects which throw the player off balance for no reason, hordes of enemies with absurd health and damage. Terraria definitely needed a bridge between the cultists and Moonlord, but this is one of the worst ways that they could have gone about it. You only need two words to really describe the problem with late game Terraria: Solar Pillar. The gear and weapons you get from the pillars are honestly pretty sick, but it's also unfortunate that no other weapons in the game are really viable for Moonlord in the higher difficulty settings. Empress of Light is the only exception to this, but even her weapons are easily outclassed by the pillar gear, even though Empress of Light is way harder than the lunatic cultists. The redeeming factor for Terraria's late game really is Moonlord. I kinda go back and forth on this boss fight. Some days I love it, other days I hate it, but I can admit that it's a great finale to the game, and it drops some of the coolest loot as well. I just wish the rest of Terraria's late game was as cool or interesting as the Moonlord, but like all things in life, you really only have one choice: lower your expectations.